The Phantom Menace. First, let's address the elephant, or rather the Gungan in the room. Jar Jar Binks ruins every scene he's in. He isn't funny by any stretch of the imagination. He destroys the mood and setting of scenes, and he's hideous to look at while providing nothing of value to each conversation, except for when he is used to move the plot forward without it being earned, like when he showed Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon the underwater city in exchange for them pretty much accidentally saving his life. It really is a shame because I feel like Jar Jar could easily be replaced with a more sophisticated character and help the story so much more. Instead, Jar Jar turned out to be a cheesy comedic relief character who makes your ears and eyes bleed. I think there are only a handful of good scenes in this movie. I think the only good scenes in this movie are the introductory scene where Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan attempt negotiations, as it is a good introduction to the setting of the Star Wars universe before the Empire, and Duel of the Fates is the other good scene, because it succeeds visually as well as through music. Really, it's an awesome scene, there's no denying that. The second and third quarter of this movie feel almost entirely irrelevant. Such little happens other than the pod race, and even that is flawed. As for the pod race, this feels like a really obvious movie cliche. The obviousness comes from the plot being forwarded by a roll of the dice. I understand that Anakin has an edge in winning because he has the Force to enhance his abilities, but this doesn't actually appear anywhere in the pod race at all. It did appear when Luke pulled his visor down at the end of A New Hope, so I would expect something similar in The Phantom Menace, given the odds Anakin faces. Really, Qui-Gon Jinn waving his hand would be enough, but we get no mention or reference of the Force during this scene. I would almost say the pod racing scene is one of the only good scenes in the movie that I mentioned, except for that it isn't really good. It succeeds at articulating the stakes of the race, but fails to provide a frame of reference to the other pod racers. Anakin has the fastest pod, but why would he? How does Anakin construct these magnificent creations like the fastest pod on Tatooine and C-3PO? He's a slave. Everything he owns belongs to Watto. Maybe Anakin has been sneaking parts away for years, but he's only 9 years old. How long could he have been doing this in the first place? Saboba breaks off a part of Anakin's pod, but watching this scene and rewatching this scene, I have no idea which malfunction this caused. You might think it causes the right turbine of Anakin's pod to come loose, but watching the scene we see that Saboba clearly pulls the piece off the left turbine. Perhaps this causes Anakin's pod to initially not start, but seeing as Anakin pretty quickly notices what's wrong and fixes it, I don't think this is it. I understand why this movie was received as horrible. It just doesn't get a lot done. Yes, it establishes the characters and that's about it. The Phantom Menace is crammed full of irrelevant scenes. The whole overarching story of the trade embargo is nearly entirely irrelevant. After establishing the characters, Episode 1 doesn't contribute anything to the bigger story of the prequels. The Trade Federation and the conflict of Episode 1 was barely brought up in the following movies. Attack of the Clones. Attack of the Clones accomplishes much more with the time used during this movie. The relationship between Anakin and Padme is advanced, and we start to see the battle Anakin faces with his emotions that inevitably corrupts him. I much appreciate how Jar Jar took much more of a sideline in this movie. Jar Jar becomes more of a relevant character because of his role as an incompetent political figurehead. This is probably one of the best roles to put Jar Jar in, considering how frustrating the character he was in the last film. The first half of this movie almost feels like a noir film with Obi-Wan searching the galaxy for pieces of the puzzle. I think one of the biggest problems this movie faces is the poor dialogue. Lines like, "You're not like Sam," completely kill the scene. Anakin's emotions are really the villain of the prequels. In Attack of the Clones, Anakin says he has nightmares about his mother, constantly in fear of her well-being. The strange part about this to me is that he's just now experiencing these feelings after 10 years of being away from her. The sudden shift is kind of ridiculous to me. Additionally, I feel like the red flags of Anakin should have been taken far more seriously by the Jedi. No one cared that Anakin went to Tatooine despite his history there. Anakin wasn't honest with the Jedi Council about his emotions. The worst part about this is that Obi-Wan and the Jedi Council constantly tell Anakin to control his emotions while worrying that he isn't able to. You would think that this would prompt the Jedi to be extra cautious with Anakin, especially considering how many powerful Jedi have fallen to the dark side in the past, but no. I don't even want to bring up force healing because that was probably the dumbest thing to be added to the Star Wars universe. It nulls every sacrifice and death when a powerful Jedi was present. Let's talk about the clone situation. Why were the clones accepted by the Council? Were the Jedi simply not aware of the orders that could potentially be acted on? Why weren't the Jedi reluctant to accept the clones, considering who ordered them in the first place? A Jedi who had been dead for a decade. I suppose the only reason the clones were accepted was because of the necessity of the army, considering how overpowering the droid quantity was. But, all of a sudden, legislation, which was previously established to be stagnated due to bureaucrats and financial corruption, was done away with, perhaps as a result of Palpatine's emergency privileges. Why was Palpatine given such power? What significance did he hold over the other senators? In Episode 1, he states their political power stems from pity in the public eye and other senators. How does that translate to Episode 2? The Trade Federation no longer has a grasp on Naboo, so it would make sense that Palpatine would assume the same political power as any other senator. For some reason, he is considered special. When Obi-Wan is captured by Dooku, I'm unsure of the intentions of the conversation. On one hand, Dooku enters and it seems like he's immediately super sarcastic, and Obi-Wan even responds as if he interpreted Dooku as sarcastic. But then, the conversation proceeds as if Obi-Wan doesn't know Dooku is a Sith. Obi-Wan tells Dooku why he's on Geonosis, which is so strange to me. And then, Dooku reveals to Obi-Wan that Darth Sidious controls the Senate. Dooku works for this guy, and he's just casually blowing his cover. We know that Dooku knows Darth Sidious and Palpatine are the same person, as shown by the beginning of Episode 3, so Dooku is just sabotaging the entire mission. But perhaps Dooku wanted to sabotage Palpatine, and if this is the case, why didn't he reveal the entire truth about Palpatine? Why not tell Obi-Wan that Palpatine is an undercover Sith with insidious intentions? I truly don't understand this scene. At least 30 Jedi showed up to the Geonosis arena, so why did one single Jedi, that being Mace Windu, go up to capture Dooku and Jango Fett? Why did Dooku not kill Windu given the chance? This happens a lot in action movies and multiple times in Star Wars, so I'd rather not talk about it every time it happens, but yeah, pretty unprofessional to sneak up on Dooku alone. As I'm watching this movie, it seems like there's literally no reason for Jango Fett to jump into the arena. Does he want the glory of killing random Jedi? I guess so. He jumps in completely randomly as shown by the surprise of Dooku, and immediately jumps for Windu's lightsaber, to then have his jetpack destroyed. It's possible that he only entered the arena knowing that he could jetpack out to safety at any time, yet he makes no attempt to run or flee once his jetpack is broken. Maybe this is a nitpick, but I feel like Jango makes no attempt to dodge Windu as Windu runs up to Jango. Let's be super charitable and assume that Jango thought he was invincible to lightsabers because of his Beskar armor as established by the Mandalorian. Still, there are many places on Jango's armor not covered by Beskar, and in an arena filled with Jedi, those exceptions of your armor will make a big difference. It's unclear in the movie as to whether or not a lightsaber could penetrate his armor, as Mace Windu slices at a place that lacked armor, but his lightsaber did cut the top of Jango's jetpack off. I looked it up, and yes, Jango's jetpack is made of Beskar, implying that a lightsaber could penetrate Jango's armor as well. So, once again, why does Jango fly into the arena? I feel like Jango is a really cool character, at least in appearance, so it's a shame to see him die for the dumbest reason possible. I laughed pretty hard when, at the beginning of the Count Dooku fight, Anakin immediately bum rushes Dooku and gets zapped. Obi-Wan even has to yell "stop" at Anakin 3 times like Anakin is a dog running into traffic. Attack of the Clones fails as far as dialogue goes, but the story has far more relevance to the trilogy than The Phantom Menace does, and this movie establishes the clone army. Whether or not that warrants its own movie, that's for you to decide. Revenge of the Sith. Revenge of the Sith is definitely the best movie in the prequel trilogy. That doesn't mean it isn't without its flaws. Firstly, we have the problem that is Anakin's visions of the future. This wouldn't be a problem if it wasn't already established that Anakin's dreams see into the future. The whole conflict that Anakin faces with his emotions seems so incredibly avoidable during this trilogy. It's no secret that the dialogue of the prequels isn't good, but there's one line in this movie that I just can't stand.
Anakin, all I want is your love.
Love won't save you, Padme. Only my new powers can do that.
It's so out of the moment to say that. The way Anakin says it sounds like he just unlocked a new video game ability. Also, Padme is 9 months pregnant with twins, and her belly is flat as a pancake up until the scene where she gives birth. Probably the most glanced over thing in the Star Wars universe is how Order 66 existed for years and the Jedi were either unaware or content with their literal genocide being a possibility. That just seems like an outrageous concept either way. I think it's silly how fast the Jedi who came to arrest Darth Sidious die. They don't really put up a fight. Jar Jar doesn't make an appearance in this movie, besides a small cameo at the very end. Apart from that, there aren't many glaring issues with this film. This movie does a good job with the established characters, and even introduces General Grievous, which makes for a great fight scene. I always thought the universe of the prequels was really interesting, even though it was somewhat out of character for Star Wars at the time. Naboo, Coruscant, and Mustafar are very flavorful to the setting. Obi-Wan's fight with Anakin at the end of the film is perhaps the best fight out of every piece of Star Wars media. I also love the line, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes." I even shoehorned it into my video. The dialogue is always trying to be poetic, and for that reason it is a double-edged sword. I think the thing the prequels need to shine better at is dialogue, and more content investing in the overarching story, rather than irrelevant subplots that take up an entire movie. Keep in mind that this entire criticism is ignoring the abundance of horrible Star Wars media we've received since the release of the prequels. The sequel trilogy was horrible, and makes the prequels look like a masterclass in storytelling. I enjoyed The Mandalorian Season 2, but just about every other TV show has been garbage. Book of Boba Fett was boring and it ruined the character. I haven't seen Kenobi, but the ratings are equally as poor. Now they're bringing back Baby Yoda to sell more toys, even though that makes no sense considering the narrative. The sequel trilogy introduces Force healing, which completely ruins the death of Qui-Gon Jinn and Anakin. It taints the legacy of George Lucas and the characters he created. Why don't I make a criticism on newer content instead? Well, it's a mound of garbage that is ever perpetuated by Disney's lust for money. Maybe when the second sequel trilogy comes out, I will make a video detailing my hatred of these movies and TV shows. While the story, setting, and characters redeem the prequel trilogy to me, the sequels are redeemed by nothing. They are horrible. The prequel trilogy is complete, and it holds a very special place in my heart, being the trilogy I grew up with. Though it isn't without its flaws, it does a great job at the one thing it was meant to do, set up the original trilogy, even though it accomplishes most of that in one of the 3 movies. Thank you for visiting Walter's World.
Walter, remember when the world was young and all the girls knew Walter's name? Walter, isn't it a shame?